Hello, and welcome to Emerging Viewpoints. I'm Nick Stoppmiller. Today we're joined by Edward Price to talk about the Federal Reserve and its fight against inflation and the impact of U.S. monetary policy on global markets, as well as how central banks around the world are responding to the current inflation shock. Edward Price is a non-resident senior fellow at NYU's Center for Global Affairs. From 2017 to 2021, he was head of the Economic Affairs Department at the British Consulate in New York, where he represented Her Majesty's government to Wall Street and US policymakers, guiding them through the Brexit process. Ed's work regularly appears in the Financial Times Alphaville, in Barron's, and he is a frequent contributor on Bloomberg Radio. Ed, welcome, and thank you for hosting us in this beautiful location.
Thank you for coming up, Nick. I really appreciate it.
So, Ed, a lot of your time is spent thinking about the Federal Reserve and the political economy around monetary policy in the US. But of course, US monetary policy affects global markets in large part because of the dollar's predominant role in global trade and finance. So, can you please talk us through what the Fed is thinking about right now, what they're concerned about, and how much they worry about the impact of their actions on countries outside of the US?
Right, that's a great question, Nick. I think perhaps the simple answer is that the Fed is thinking about what it always thinks about, which is to say that the Fed's thinking about how best to enact its dual mandate. Okay, so obviously stable prices and full employment. I think maybe the slightly complicated answer is that there's a third thing that the Fed is thinking about, and has been since the global financial crisis back in 2007 and 8, and that is, for want of a better expression, financial stability. So if I was being cheeky on your podcast, I might say that the Fed is actually dealing with a triple mandate. Now, herein lies the complication. If you think about pursuing full employment, probably the best way to describe that is that the Fed wants some sort of reasonable inflationary pressure in the US economy. If you talk about how to enact the stable prices aspect of the dual mandate, you could describe that as the Fed wanting some sort of reasonable deflationary pressure in the United States economy. And were you so inclined, you might say that if you can balance those forces over time, therein is some sort of equilibrium that central bankers will go to great lengths to describe. Now, that's probably elusive anyway, because the growth implied with an inflationary pressure or an inflationary policy pressure and the restraint on growth implied by a deflationary policy pressure, as we know, is very, very hard to juggle. There is a business cycle, there are recessions. But it's made perhaps even more difficult by the fact that the Fed has a $9 trillion balance sheet and has been worrying alongside regulators and other policymakers and Treasury officials for a long time now about what exactly will happen to financial markets if what I call the great accommodation is wound down in a way that's either disorderly or at all. So to round off the point, the Fed's doing what it's always done, which is trying to enact its dual mandate. There's a third concern lurking in the background all the time, which is financial stability. You might describe that as a triple mandate. And then, of course, we have the war in Ukraine and the global situation and the global inflation landscape. So to be fair to the Fed, I think they're thinking about a lot, and I think they've probably been asked to do too much.
Well, the point you made about the Fed's balance sheet, I think, is a very relevant one for emerging markets, because my impression is no one really has a very strong answer as to how much the Fed's balance sheet expansion through QE has impacted emerging markets or other risk assets. But everyone seems to agree that it did give them a bit of a boost. And so if you get into a QT, a quantitative tightening phase, you could have a disorderly unwind of risk in emerging markets. And do you think that concerns the Fed at all?
Well, it's a great question. Again, I mean, I think everything concerns the Fed in the sense that it has some of the best economists in the world and they're studying the global economy, right? So, of course, anything that smacks of disorderly anywhere in the world, the Fed is going to think about and worry about to some degree. But I would suspect that the situation in emerging markets is probably something that's a dependent variable in the Fed's thinking now and not an independent variable, the Ukraine situation aside. And by that I mean yes, if you go back and look at the history of emerging market crises, if you go back and look at the 97, 98 East Asia crisis and Russia and so on, these crises influenced massively how policymakers think about global capital flows, global capital mobility, um, what exactly it is that constitutes a healthy economy. Because if you remember before East Asia, the IMF was pretty happy with most of the economies in that region, didn't think that they had any sort of potential for a disorderly risk exposure. They did, as it turns out. So, so it's a bit of a conundrum. I mean, on the one hand, yes, the Fed probably doesn't want to induce, in what is effectively wartime, any sort of sudden stop among economies that may or may not be part of future supply chains. But on the other hand, of course, the situation at home with inflation, 7-8%, right, and it's not transitory, it's obviously persistent. I think the situation at home is probably what they're thinking about as the number one issue.
So you talked about the Fed's dual mandate, where they have both inflation and unemployment targets, or at least sustainability in both of those areas. And other central banks around the world have inflation as a primary mandate and growth as a secondary mandate. Some only have an inflation mandate. But I have to imagine that there's no central bank in the world that wants to be blamed for engineering a recession in the process of hitting their inflation mandate.
Right.
But this is something that kind of concerns me because the impact of tightening monetary policy on slowing inflation versus bringing growth down may not be symmetrical. In other words, you may get into the situation where you have to create a recession in order to bring inflation down to your target. And what I'm wondering is, do you think any central bank feels political pressure on this front that, yes, they have to get inflation down, but they don't want to get blamed for a recession? So, you know, would they do something that they wouldn't confess to later? In other words, would they intentionally create a recession to bring inflation down to target?
Yes, I think they would, and I think they will. That's not to say that's not to say that there won't be a careful apolitical political process of communication, and it doesn't mean that you saw Yellen the other day confess that she got inflation wrong. You saw Powell in 2018 confess that our star is elusive, and so on. So I think that central bankers are super smart people, and they're very aware that they're in a political economy. But they're also very well aware that the litmus test of central bank independence is whether or not they are willing to, in your phrase, induce a recession, i.e., to introduce a series of hikes at a pace that is suitable and at a level that is suitable for controlling inflation. Right? I mean, what else is central bank independence for, other than the ability to let voters down? Right? And that's why we place a premium on the technocratic, independent nature of central banking. I would add that as a thought experiment, if you took someone and said, look, here's the data on central banking for the last, say, 35 years, and we want you to just look at these charts, and we want you to understand the QE program aforementioned, and we want you to tell us if you think these central banks are independent. I imagine most people would say, probably not. It doesn't look like these central banks are independent at all because they've been pumping money. They've been clipping coins, essentially, right? So your question is very interesting because we've been through this incredible experiment. We've basically decided to create fiat currency of nothing immediately whenever we want in response to any policy challenge. I imagine that that's probably what a benevolent king would want a central bank to do. I don't think that looks very independent. And now, of course, we're sort of looking over the precipice and thinking, uh-oh, like somebody needs to sort this out. It probably can't be the White House. It probably has to be the central bank.
Well, that's an interesting point right there because we have a lot of inflationary pressures due to excess demand in the global economy. But there are also a lot of supply side pressures, particularly food and energy prices, which have been exacerbated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And this is something that elected officials would struggle to work on, dealing with the impact of high food and energy prices in their populations. But it's something that central banks have zero control over. No monetary policy is going to change the price of wheat or oil.
Right.
And so you have this strange conundrum where the central bank is meant to deal with inflation, but you have policymakers who are getting real political flack from their populations
Right.
because of high food and energy prices, and are probably tempted to act in many ways to try to mitigate those price pressures. So, does that create a risk of politicization of inflation targeting, where presidents and parliaments of countries are getting involved on the supply side with food and energy, while central banks are trying to do something with monetary policy to deal with demand?
Yes, I think that broadly speaking, the fiscal domain and the monetary domain now can definitely act at odds within their intersection. But I think we've probably already seen the politicization of monetary policy. Maybe another way of saying what I was just saying is if we go back and look at the flexible average inflation target that was introduced. This for me is, I mean, you can look up what I've written on this. Maybe I was a little bit irreverent, but for me, this was a mistake because if you turn around and say, well, look, we're going to, on the one hand, push inflation above its 2% target because somewhere behind us is a period of basically zero inflation. And if we go to 3, 4, 5, whatever, we can eventually get to what we call 2 on average. You're playing a very risky game there because of inflation expectations, which is what I think we're seeing now. So another way of saying that is maybe there are 2 political ways of dealing with inflation. The first is as inflation starts to turn up, you ignore it. And you think to yourself, oh, if prices are slightly higher, perhaps continuing on the path of accommodation makes sense because XYZ supply shock, whatever the causes, whatever the exogenous causes of this inflation, it will go away. And we might as well support households and their purchasing power through supporting employment, right? I think that's what we did with the transitory narrative. Of course, after a while, if it turns out that inflation is persistent, which is what we saw, that political narrative goes away, right? And you're really in trouble. And so the second way that you deal with inflation politically is to prepare the labour market for the band-aid to be ripped off. And I mean, reading through, as everyone else does, reading through recent Fed transcripts and such, and watching these guys, I think that's what they're preparing to do. And that's back to your point about whether they're politically aware, whether they're politically operative. I think they are. So yes, and again, in defense of the Fed, I think it's difficult. I don't think there's an equilibrium point that you can point to and say, okay, cool, this is the exact policy, the exact time. I think they're dealing with great uncertainty.
And you talked about the interplay between monetary and fiscal policy, which I think is quite an apt subject of discussion because in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, we had a lot of monetary stimulus, but not a lot of fiscal stimulus. And then in the COVID-induced recession, you had a large dose of both monetary and fiscal stimulus. And now we're in this phase where there's sort of a hangover from all that stimulus, and you're starting to get, not just in the U.S. but across emerging markets, you're getting a fiscal drag because governments are pulling back that excess fiscal support, and you're getting this global impulse of monetary tightening at the same time. And what I wonder is there a way for monetary and fiscal policy to be coordinated in a way that they're not at cross purposes, but at the same time avoid politicization? Because of course, fiscal policy is a purely political endeavor, and monetary policy, in theory, should be a completely apolitical endeavor.
Right. My goodness. Well, I mean, that's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? You'd like to think so. You'd like to think so. You'd like to look at the United States economy and say, again, we're in a position now that is dangerous. We're going into recession. Let's be honest about it. What is it that the fiscal side and the monetary side could do in terms of a handshake to better navigate through this position? It's difficult. I mean, is anything in the United States political economy today able to be apolitical? So I don't want to answer your question with a question, right? That's a cop out. But maybe answer it like this: when in President Trump's term he introduced a late cycle stimulus, I think the Democrats found that very hard to argue with because it was stimulus, right? And now that President Biden has done the same, and arguably in a worse fiscal position, but arguably for better reasons because of the pandemic, again, it's difficult for the Democrats to sort of say that's too much, right? And flip that over to the Republicans. They possibly, in theory, should have asked the president to slow down on fiscal, and possibly should have agreed that the fiscal that Biden is, so it's kind of a mess. It's, where exactly the clean political lines on fiscal lie. So in theory, yes, I think we can do better as economic policymakers, but because things are politicized, and because they're going to get more politicized, I don't see the vector. I don't see how the central bank, in all good faith, and how the Treasury Department would come up with something, unless it was a real innovation, right? Unless it was some sort of new working group or open admission that this is what they're doing. I think it would be very difficult for the Fed to avoid getting embroiled in essentially culture wars.
So, Ed, one thing I'd like to ask you about is the experience of the US Federal Reserve and having a 2% inflation target, which means that the neutral nominal rate is probably somewhere between 2 and 4%, if you assume that R star is somewhere between 0 and 2. Which induces the zero lower bound problem, which is if you have a neutral rate of, say, 3%, you can only stimulate down to a nominal rate of 0, which is 3% below your natural rate. So there's been some discussion as to whether that's ideal and whether maybe a 2% inflation target is too low. And in the emerging world, you have different inflation targets across different central banks, but a lot of the central bank targets are kind of around 4%. But there's in a few countries, Brazil is starting to move below 4% for their inflation target. There was some discussion before the war about Russia possibly moving below 4% for their inflation target. But when you get into emerging markets that are more volatile and might need more stimulus during deeper downturns, they would hit this zero low bound problem that the Fed has and other developed market central banks. So can you talk us through what the experience of the zero lower bound has been for the Fed and what that means, and whether you think it really is desirable to have a 2% inflation target in a developed or emerging economy?
Right. So policy space was the talk of the town for a long time, right? The lack of policy space and this concern that because we'd entered into the environment that you've just described, we would encounter a future shock or crisis and not be able to respond sufficiently. So it was, for a while, as you recall, it was sort of heralded as the potential death of effective monetary policy. I think there was some truth to that, because if you think about it, at some point, what was at that time an unprecedented liquidity support function in the policy space for the economy in 2007-8, at some point that just became normal, right? And at some point, and the taper tantrum is and the Bernanke is the classic example of this. And at some point, the market said, no, we want more sugar. We want this sugar to continue forever. So it kind of became normal, right? My sort of perhaps slightly naughty answer to this is that no, 2% probably doesn't make sense in the political economy, and the flexible average that we were talking about was probably an attempt to push that up and to create policy space over time. But again, back to this idea of a triple mandate. The lack of policy space below us should certainly be a concern when we're thinking about how to handle the real economy and how to take ourselves out of the trough. I would argue there's also probably some sort of upper bound somewhere, call it the X upper bound, in which the monetary authorities set central bank policy at a position that is bad for the financial economy, right? And we would see things fall off a cliff if we hit X percent in the policy rate. So is that something that lends itself to a nice formula, a rule? I don't think so. And I think that because we went through this extended period of persistently low inflation, the Fed did say to itself, well, hold on a second, we do need to get to a position where we've taken off so that we can set back down later, right? So we can get back to that kind of smoothing of growth function in monetary policy. But I also worry that in doing so, and maybe we're seeing this play out now, we're going to start pushing into a scenario where a series of sharp rate hikes, which should happen, by the way, hit the financial economy and hit financial stability. And then we are unraveling the experiment, not in a controlled way, but in a chaotic way.
Well, this is an interesting point here because you point to the possibility that there are two sets of expectations, one for the real economy and an optimal path of monetary policy that brings inflation to target with some sort of side growth mandate on there. And the other is an optimal monetary path that accommodates financial markets. And do you think that that these two are compatible? I mean, would any central bank be forced to choose between the real economy and the financial markets?
Yes. Any central bank at some point has to choose between the real economy and financial markets. And moreover, any central bank at some point has to choose between the labor market and full employment and stable prices. And so I would argue that the dual mandate itself is a contradiction in terms. This is not the fault of the Fed, this is the fault of Congress. But it's a contradiction in terms because, as I said, it's asking for a magic trick. It's asking for an equilibrium position that you could argue cannot and does not exist, i.e., the perfect salt of inflationary pressure and the perfect pepper of deflationary pressure in the economy. So that doesn't happen, right? We see that doesn't happen. And if you read between the lines, the way that the Fed over years has really enacted its dual mandate, it's been a little bit, I wouldn't say a sleight of hand because that sounds rude, but it's been clever about it. So if you look at the idea of structural unemployment, that gives you a bit of flexibility on defining exactly when and how you've met your full employment mandate, right? And if you think about the idea of a 2% inflation target, well, if you're being pedantic about it, that's not stable prices, right? Literally, that's not stable prices at all. So I think that, and back to the point on politics, I think any central bank has a bias in the sense that it is biased towards growth over the long term. Probably climate problems aside, that's been what they should have been doing. That's a good thing. But that over time translates into an inflationary bias. And I suppose the great hope, the great bet that we've made in Western economies is that since the 1970s, well, okay, we can accept more market volatility. We can have FX markets that no one controls or probably no one understands, right? Very few people understand, maybe Alex Lipton. But we are going to allow that because the volatility of the upcycle will sufficiently develop the supply side in a way that over time output and productivity will be superior to the alternative, which is playing it safe. So maybe I've gone off on a tangent there, but I don't think that an inflationary episode followed by a deflationary episode is something we can escape in a free market economy.
And talking of QE, so of course, when the Fed reached the zero lower bound in 2008, we started getting quantitative easing, asset purchases. In the US, it was Treasury and mortgage backed securities. And then we had 3 rounds of QE, and then we hit the COVID crisis, and the Fed expanded that toolbox by quite a bit, buying all sorts of risk assets. And the interesting thing that happened in 2020 is that emerging market central banks started taking a page out of the Fed's playbook. And although most of them sort of denied that it was quantitative easing, they said that it was ensuring proper market functioning. A lot of EM central banks started buying their own government's bonds on the open market. And I wonder, how did the 2008 crisis open Pandora's box in the sense that you got this new toolkit, so central banks got comfortable with the idea that there's zero lower bound, but there's a policy option outside of that. And do you think that that Pandora's box, once it was opened, creates risk for central banks to be less independent if they're starting to get actively involved in the financial markets through asset purchases?
Yes, and it creates a risk for financial markets that they're essentially nationalized, right? At least on one side of every transaction. So I think in hindsight, the 2007-8 policy response, it was welcomed and it was necessary. And I don't think you find anyone that's worked in economic policy or studied policy who would say that we shouldn't have done anything. If anything, I think nowadays historians are looking back and saying maybe it wasn't quite enough, and particularly in the US and Europe. But for me, in retrospect, this idea that you enter into a QE or whatever you want to call it, which is essentially purchasing assets in order to prop up market liquidity and or asset prices. I mean, that's not drinking to cure a hangover, right? Like, it works. We've all done it in university, right? We've got up and gone, oh my goodness, I'll have a beer at noon, But it kind of makes things worse. So, you know, I don't want to sit here in the comfort of my deck chair and sort of criticize central banks and harp on about all the mistakes that they've made. I think it's intrinsically the case that central banking has an inflationary tilt because it's a part of the growth model, right? Um, but if you say to yourself, look, we don't ever want corrections, we don't ever want mild crises. We have to avoid the bogeyman of illiquidity, which is essentially the essence of the problem in 2007-8. Fine, you're going to avoid the problem of illiquidity, but you are doubling down on the long-term risks of inflation. And so I'm among those who look now at monetary policy and look at the path of monetary policy over the last 15 years and think this is a problem for fiat currency itself, which is already an experiment. And I have lots of friends who would, if they see this, I get in trouble, right? But for me, that's also a dollar standard story. And at some point, as robust as it is, the dollar itself, I think, and those who administer it really have to think about a $9 trillion balance sheet as a global geopolitical risk, as something that you could really think about in the next 20 years as threatening the value of the dollar itself.
Ed, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for a fascinating discussion.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. I'm a big fan.
Thank you.